The universe has 23,000 catalogued agricultural worlds. Earth isn't one of them. Earth is what happens when a planet actively tries to kill everything on it, and somehow, inexplicably, humans decided to grow tomatoes there anyway. Grevin Thol had been processing agricultural certification applications for the Interstellar Farming Commission for 96 cycles, and in all that time, not once had he encountered a Form 83B submitted from a Class 12 hazard world. Class 12. The kind of world where geological surveys came back with helpful notes like surface actively hostile and recommend evacuation of survey team immediately, and for the love of all that exists, why would anything live here? Yet here it was, sitting on his desk like a small thermonuclear device disguised as paperwork. Application for entry, Galactic Agricultural Excellence Competition, submitted by one Coleman Hux from something called Earth. Grevin's secondary eye stalks swiveled to reread the planetary classification. Class 12, atmospheric violence quotient of 8.3, geological instability rating of 6.9, and the bit that made his feeding tentacles clench involuntarily, predator density index of 9.2. For context, Grevin's own homeworld, which his clutchmates affectionately called the Murder Swamp, rated a 4.1. He did what any sensible being would do when confronted with cosmic impossibility. He filed it under probable administrative error and went to lunch. The application, however, had other ideas. It reappeared on his desk the next morning with a cheerful sticky note from the classification department. Confirmed, Class 12, good luck. The note had a small drawing of what Grevin could only assume was meant to be his face, screaming. 3 departments and 5 bureaucratic transfers later, the application landed on the desk of Vexin Kaur, Senior Director of Agricultural Assessment, who had the kind of job where people only remembered you existed when something had gone catastrophically wrong. Vexin stared at the application for a long time, then she stared at the attached documentation, which included photographs of a bipedal creature standing in front of rows of vegetation, smiling, on a Class 12 world. Behind the creature, she could see what appeared to be an atmospheric pressure differential event, what the humans apparently called a storm, the kind that generated wind speeds capable of stripping flesh from bone. The human was wearing what looked like a fabric covering and appeared to be pointing proudly at some sort of orange spherical plant matter. Vexin did what any sensible senior director would do. She called an emergency meeting. 12 hours later, Coleman Hux received a message on his tablet while checking the irrigation system in the North 40. The message was marked urgent in 14 different languages, including 3 he'd never heard of. Dear Mr. Hux, it began, with the kind of formality that suggested lawyers had been consulted. We have received your application for the Galactic Agricultural Excellence Competition. Before we can proceed, we require immediate clarification on several points. Specifically, are you in fact claiming to conduct active agricultural operations on a planetary body classified as Class 12 hazardous? Coleman scratched his chin and looked out at his farm. 500 acres of corn, wheat, soybeans, and about 3 acres of pumpkins because his daughter had insisted. In the distance he could see his dog, Ranger, chasing something through the bean field, probably a rabbit. Overhead, clouds were building up for the afternoon thunderstorm, right on schedule. Yeah, he typed back, that's correct. Is there a problem? 68 light-years away, Vexin Kaur read this response and felt something in her cranial cavity begin to throb in a way that medical science couldn't quite explain. Is there a problem? She said aloud to her empty office. Is there a problem? She typed back, her manipulators clicking across the input device with barely controlled fury. Mr. Hux, Class 12 worlds have an annual mortality rate exceeding 98% for all surveyed species. The atmospheric conditions alone should render complex agriculture impossible. We have noted storm systems, extreme temperature variations, and radiation levels that exceed safety margins by factors of 60. Our question is not whether there is a problem. Our question is, how are you alive? Coleman read this while replacing a busted PTO shaft on his tractor. He wiped his hands on his jeans and considered his response carefully. "Well," he typed, "my granddad always said farming ain't for the faint of heart. We get by. Been in my family for 6 generations now. You need pictures of the crops or something?" Vexin attached 37 pages of planetary hazard assessment to her next message, along with a strongly worded suggestion that perhaps Mr. Hux had confused Earth with a different planet, possibly one where organic life could exist without constant mortal terror. Coleman read through the assessment with growing confusion. Dangerous precipitation patterns? That was just rain. Severe atmospheric electrical discharge events? Those were thunderstorms. Potentially lethal local fauna? Well, yeah, you had to watch out for coyotes and the occasional bear, but that's what the shotgun by the door was for. He wrote back, "Look, I don't know who wrote this report, but they make it sound like we're living on a volcano or something. It's just a farm. Pretty normal stuff. We had a good yield last year. Wheat came in strong. Corn was decent despite the drought in July. I'm particularly proud of my heirloom tomatoes. Do you want me to send samples?" In her office, Vexin made a sound that her species had evolved specifically to express the concept of, "Why do I continue to work here when my cousin has that nice job at the water purification plant?" She scheduled a call, an actual call, with audio transmission, because this had officially exceeded the boundaries of reasonable electronic communication. When Coleman's face appeared on her screen, several things immediately struck Vexin. First, the creature looked remarkably calm for something living in what was essentially a cosmic abattoir. Second, it was wearing a fabric covering with text that read, "Corn, it's amazing," which suggested either a sophisticated sense of humor or a complete break with reality. Third, behind him, through a transparent barrier, she could see the outside environment, and her blood pressure immediately increased by 30%. "Mr. Hux," she began, trying to maintain professional composure, "I'm looking at your atmospheric conditions right now, and I can see what appears to be water falling from the sky." "That's rain," Coleman said helpfully. "Good for the crops." "Your planet throws water at you from above." "Well, yeah. How else would it get there?" Vexin pulled up her own planetary data. "Moisture osmosis through root systems connected to subsurface aquifers, like civilized worlds." "Huh," Coleman said. "That sounds complicated. Rain's pretty simple. Shows up, waters everything, leaves. Sometimes we get too much, sometimes not enough, but that's farming." "And the electrical discharges?" "Lightning? Yeah, that comes with the storms usually. Lost a tree to it last year, but that's what lightning rods are for." "You have defensive installations against your own weather?" "I mean, I guess. Never thought of it that way. They're just lightning rods. About $8 at the hardware store." Vexin was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Hux, I need to be very clear with you. In the entire history of the Interstellar Farming Commission, spanning 3,000 cycles and encompassing agricultural operations across 89 galaxies, we have never received an application from a Class 12 world. The reason for this is simple. Class 12 worlds don't have agriculture. They have death. They are studied exclusively by xenogeologists with a gambling problem and combat veterans seeking employment opportunities that validate their trauma." Coleman nodded slowly. "So, is that a yes or a no on the competition?" "The regulations," Vexin said, in the tone of someone clinging to bureaucracy like a life raft in a storm, "do not technically prohibit entry from Class 12 worlds because the scenario was deemed too absurd to require specific prohibition. It falls under the general category of things that cannot possibly happen and therefore need no rules." "But I'm happening right now," Coleman pointed out. "Yes, Mr. Hux, I'm painfully aware." "Ooh," 3 cycles of paperwork, medical waivers, and psychological evaluations later, the Interstellar Farming Commission made an announcement that reverberated through agricultural circles across 23,000 worlds. A human from Earth had been accepted into the Galactic Agricultural Excellence Competition. The response was immediate and varied. Most agricultural worlds assumed it was a clerical error. Several placed bets on how quickly the human would withdraw. 3 separate academic institutions launched studies on mass delusion in bureaucratic systems. One farmer, a Kelthrian named Plix Toran, who had won the competition 3 cycles running for his exceptional cultivation of moisture-sensitive fungi on his homeworld's carefully climate-controlled biodomes, found the news hilarious. "A Deathworlder?" he chittered to his associates. "What's he going to enter? Photographs of things that tried to kill him. Best agricultural achievement under fire? I'll believe it when I see it." Plix's homeworld, Kelthria Prime, was considered quite challenging for agriculture. It required constant monitoring to maintain the precise temperature range of 18 to 21 degrees, humidity within a 2% variance, and absolutely no atmospheric disturbances of any kind. They'd spent 600 cycles perfecting the dome technology. When Plix heard that Earth experienced something called seasons, where the entire planet changed temperature by up to 30 degrees over the course of a solar cycle, he assumed the translation software had malfunctioned. The competition was set to take place in 6 standard months, which gave Vexin just enough time to organize what she privately called the inspection of the damned. Because here was the thing about the Galactic Agricultural Excellence Competition. You couldn't just claim to have impressive agricultural operations. You had to prove it, which meant inspectors had to visit the farm. Normally, this was a pleasant affair. Inspectors would arrive, tour the facilities, take samples, verify yields, and file reports. The most exciting thing that typically happened was someone offering them locally grown refreshments. But sending inspectors to a Class 12 world, that required a very different approach. That required volunteers willing to risk their lives for bureaucratic completeness. That required hazard pay exceeding the annual budget of small planetary governments. That required people who either had nothing to lose or who were, and this was the technical term, completely insane. Vexin posted the job opening with a simple description. Agricultural inspection of Class 12 world, extreme hazard pay. Comprehensive life insurance included, waiver of liability required, next of kin notification forms mandatory. She received 3 applications. The first was from Denick Moore, a Xylothian whose entire agricultural career had been spent in hermetically sealed growing facilities where the most dangerous thing he'd encountered was a pH imbalance in the nutrient solution. He'd applied because the hazard pay would let him retire immediately. His application included a note, "I have accepted that I will probably die. Please ensure my pension goes to my spawn group." The second was from Telia Quinn, a Vraxian who had previously worked as a combat medic in the frontier wars and had decided that agricultural inspection seemed calmer. Her application included 17 citations for valor and a psychological evaluation marked concerningly comfortable with danger. The third was from Yennet Pol, a jovial heptarian who wrote simply, "I have lived a full life and am curious to see what could possibly be classified as more dangerous than my ex-mate's cooking. Also, the hazard pay is excellent." Vexin approved all 3, scheduled their life insurance policies, and began drafting condolence letters just in case. The inspection team arrived on Earth on a Tuesday, which Coleman had assured them was a pretty normal day weather-wise. The shuttle touched down in a field adjacent to Coleman's farm, and for a long moment nobody moved. They sat in the climate-controlled safety of their vessel, staring out at what could only be described as organized chaos masquerading as an ecosystem. "That's a lot of green," Denick said quietly. Everything's moving, Telia observed. The plants are moving in the wind. There's something flying, Yennet added, pointing at a bird, with biological wings, in open air. That's not tethered to anything. They watched the bird for several minutes, waiting for it to fall out of the sky or burst into flames or do any of the things that seemed reasonable for an organic creature attempting unassisted flight on a Class 12 world. The bird, oblivious to their existential crisis, landed on a fence post and began preening. "Okay," Telia said, checking her hazard suit for the 18th time. "According to protocol, we exit the vessel, conduct initial atmospheric assessment, and establish contact with the local operator. According to sanity," Dennick countered, "we file a report saying everything is on fire, agriculture impossible, and leave immediately." "Nothing's on fire," Yennet pointed out. "Yet," Dennick said. "Nothing's on fire yet." Coleman chose that moment to walk over from the house, wiping his hands on his jeans. He waved cheerfully at the shuttle. "Is he approaching us?" Telia said, "without protective gear?" "He's wearing cloth," Dennick whimpered. "Just cloth." Coleman knocked on the shuttle door, which created a metallic sound that made all three inspectors jump. Telia, drawing on her military training, pressed the external communication button. "Mr. Hux? That's me. Welcome to Earth. Y'all want to come out? I've got fresh lemonade up at the house." "Mr. Hux, our readings indicate that your atmospheric pressure is, well, it's within normal parameters, but the composition—" "Oh, you mean the oxygen? Yeah, we got plenty of that, about 21%. Good stuff." "That's a reactive gas, Mr. Hux." "Well, sure, but that's how we breathe." "You folks breathe something different?" After 30 minutes of explanation about the various atmospheric compositions that supported life throughout the galaxy, most of which contained significantly less explosive reactive gas, Coleman convinced them that the air wouldn't immediately kill them. The inspection team emerged from the shuttle in full hazard suits, breathing their own atmosphere, and stood in Coleman's field like three nervous astronauts on a hostile moon. Except this wasn't a moon, this was a farm. They could see rows of crops stretching into the distance, actual crops, growing in dirt, just sitting there in the open air like it was normal. "So," Coleman said, gesturing broadly, "what would you like to see first? We've got corn over here, wheat's in the south field, and the vegetable gardens up by the house. Oh, and the chickens, but we can save them for later if you want." "Chickens?" Yennet asked weakly. "Birds. We keep 'em for eggs. They're pretty friendly mostly. You keep atmospheric flying creatures for food production?" "Well, for eggs specifically, though we do eat them sometimes when they stop laying. Circle of life and all that." Dennick made a sound like air escaping from a pressurized chamber. They began with the cornfield, which seemed the least immediately threatening. Coleman walked between the rows, pointing out various features, while the inspection team followed at what they considered a safe distance of approximately 40 feet. "This year, we're trying a hybrid variety," Coleman explained, "more drought-resistant. Last year we had a dry spell in August that really hit the yields, so I figured I'd try something new." "Drought," Telia repeated, consulting her datapad. "That's when the water precipitation stops?" "Yep, sometimes for weeks at a time. And the plants just continue existing." "Well, they get stressed, but yeah, we irrigate when we can, but sometimes you just have to wait for rain." "But what if it doesn't rain?" Coleman shrugged. "Then it's a bad year. That's farming." This casual acceptance of catastrophic agricultural failure nearly caused Dennick to have a medical incident inside his hazard suit. They walked deeper into the farm, and with each step, the inspection team encountered new horrors. A rabbit darted across their path, and Yennet drew his defensive weapon before Coleman could explain that rabbits were mostly harmless unless you're a lettuce. And an insect landed on Telia's suit, and the entire team froze while Coleman identified it as a ladybug and explained that it was one of the good ones because it ate aphids, which were apparently different insects that ate the crops, which meant there was an entire war happening at the microscopic level that farmers just accepted as baseline reality. When they reached the equipment barn, things got worse. "This here's my tractor," Coleman said, patting the large machine affectionately. 35 years old, still runs like a dream. Well, mostly. The hydraulics are a bit touchy. The inspection team stared at what was essentially a motorized vehicle with exposed mechanical components and rotating blades and absolutely no safety containment fields. "You operate this?" Denick asked, personally. "Every day during planting and harvest. It's not so bad once you get the hang of it." "Where's the emergency medical pod?" "The what now?" "The emergency medical pod, for when the rotating death blades inevitably cause traumatic injury." "Oh, you mean a first aid kit?" "There's one in the house. But I've been farming for 30 years and never needed more than a band-aid. Well, except for that time with the hay baler, but that was mostly my fault for not paying attention." The fact that Coleman had a previous incident with farm equipment and was treating it as a minor anecdote rather than a life-changing trauma made Telia reconsider her entire career path. But the true horror came when Coleman suggested they see the weather station. "Weather station?" Yennet asked hopefully. "Is that where you control the weather?" "Control? No, it just tells me what's coming." "What's coming?" Coleman pulled up the forecast on his tablet. "Looks like we got a storm rolling in tonight. Should be a good one, maybe an inch of rain, little bit of wind. Might see some lightning." The inspection team looked at each other, then at the sky, where clouds were indeed beginning to gather. Then at Coleman, who seemed pleased about this development. "You know the atmospheric violence is approaching," Telia said slowly, "and you're staying here." "Well, yeah, it's my farm. Mr. Hook's protocol dictates that when atmospheric conditions become hostile, all personnel evacuate to shelter. I mean, I'll go inside when it hits. No point standing in the rain." "That's not shelter. That's a fabric and wood structure." Coleman looked back at his house, which had stood there for 140 years through countless storms, tornadoes, and one memorable hailstorm that had required a new roof. "It's pretty solid. Foundation's concrete, walls are good. We'll be fine." "What's the structural integrity rating? It holds up the roof?" By the time the storm actually arrived that evening, the inspection team had retreated to their shuttle and were monitoring conditions from what they considered a minimum safe distance, which in their calculation would have been a different planet, but they were committed to their professional duties. From inside the shuttle, they watched the storm roll across Coleman's farm. Lightning crackled across the sky. Wind bent the cornstalks nearly horizontal. Rain fell in sheets so thick they could barely see the house, and through it all they could see Coleman, visible through his kitchen window, calmly eating dinner. "He's consuming nutrients," Denick said in horror, "during an atmospheric attack." "Look at the plants," Yennet said, pointing at the fields visible through the rain. "They're still there. They're not being destroyed." "They're bending," Telia observed, "but not breaking. They're designed for this." The implications of this settled over them slowly. These crops had evolved on this nightmare world. They were adapted to conditions that would kill a properly civilized plant in minutes, and humans had taken these already terrifying organisms and made them better at surviving. They domesticated the chaos. When the storm passed an hour later, Coleman came out to check on them, splashing through puddles in rubber boots. "Y'all doing okay in there? That was a pretty light one, as storms go." "Light?" the entire inspection team shouted in unison. "Yeah, barely any lightning. Good rain, though. The corn'll love this." They spent 3 days on Coleman's farm, and each day added new layers to their understanding of the absolute insanity of Earth agriculture. There was the day they discovered the concept of pest control, which involved Coleman actively battling other Earth organisms for possession of the crops. He showed them his various methods: scarecrows for the crows, which were birds large enough to potentially carry off small creatures; netting to keep out deer, which were apparently herbivores the size of a small vehicle with weapons on their heads; and something called diatomaceous earth for insects, which Dennick refused to touch after learning it was made of fossilized microscopic organisms. "So you're spreading the remains of the dead across your crops?" Dennick asked. "It keeps the slugs off the tomatoes," Coleman replied, as if this was a reasonable explanation. There was the day they learned about the seasonal cycle, where Coleman explained that in a few months all the green things would die. The temperature would drop below the freezing point of water, and frozen water would fall from the sky to cover everything in a blanket that could be several feet deep. "And then what?" Telia asked. "Then spring comes, and we plant again." But everything died. The annuals died, the perennials are just sleeping. The concept of plants that could survive being frozen solid and then resume growing made Yennet question everything he'd learned in agricultural school. There was the day they met the chickens, which turned out to be small bipedal dinosaur descendants that Coleman kept in a fenced enclosure, where they spent their days scratching in the dirt, eating bugs, and producing eggs through a biological process that the inspection team agreed never to discuss again. "They're producing food," Dennick said faintly, "using nothing but bugs and plant matter and their own internal biology." "That's pretty standard for chickens," Coleman agreed. "There's nothing standard about any of this." But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Coleman took them to see his vegetable garden. The garden was located behind the house, a plot maybe 60 feet by 30 feet, enclosed by a wooden fence. Inside, the inspection team saw what could only be described as controlled agricultural chaos. Dozens of species growing in close proximity, tomatoes climbing wooden stakes, beans winding up strings, squash spreading across the ground, peppers in neat rows, herbs tucked into corners. "This is my wife's domain mostly," Coleman explained. "She's got a real green thumb." "There are dozens of different species here," Telia said, scanning with her instruments. "In the same soil, sharing resources. That should create catastrophic competition." "Well, some plants do better next to others. Sarah's got a whole system. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which the tomatoes like. The marigolds keep some pests away. It's all connected. This is ecological complexity at a level that should require computational modeling and centuries of research. Sarah mostly goes by what her grandma taught her and trial and error." At that moment, Sarah Hucks emerged from the house carrying a basket. She was a woman in her early 60s, wearing a sun hat and gloves, and she greeted the inspection team with the same casual warmth Coleman had shown. "You must be the folks from the Space Commission," she said cheerfully. "Coleman said you were here. I'm about to do some harvesting if you want to see." They watched in fascinated horror as Sarah moved through the garden, selecting ripe tomatoes with practiced ease, pulling carrots from the soil, snipping herbs with small shears. She was directly handling the produce, with only thin fabric gloves between her skin and these organisms that had been growing in dirt, exposed to all the horrors of Earth's atmosphere. "Do you want to try one?" Sarah asked, offering a small tomato to the inspection team. "These are the cherry tomatoes. They're particularly sweet this year." The inspection team looked at the tomato as if it were an improvised explosive device. "You consume these?" Yennet asked. "Directly? Without processing?" "Well, I usually wash them first, but yeah, best fresh. But they've been outside. That's where tomatoes grow, honey." Sarah bit into a tomato herself, and the inspection team watched the juice run down her chin as she smiled. "Perfect," she declared. Later that evening, back in the shuttle, the inspection team compiled their findings. The report grew longer and longer as they tried to document everything they'd witnessed. Telia was on her 18th page of safety violations before she realized that the entire planet was a safety violation and there was no way to catalog it all. "We need to focus," Dennick said. "What's the core finding here?" "That humans are insane," Yennet suggested. Too subjective. We need empirical data. They pulled up the competition criteria and began checking Coleman's farm against each requirement. Crop diversity? Coleman grew 15 different crops across his 500 acres, not counting the vegetable garden. Most competition entries focused on a single optimized crop. Check. Yield efficiency? Coleman's corn produced 160 bushels per acre, which was apparently pretty good for non-irrigated. The Kelthrian fungi everyone expected to win produced the equivalent of 80 bushels per acre in carefully controlled conditions. Check. Sustainability? Coleman's farm had been operated by his family for 6 generations, using crop rotation and integrated pest management. The Vraxian crystal grain operations required complete nutrient solution replacement every cycle. Check. Innovation? Coleman was testing new hybrid varieties, had implemented precision agriculture techniques using satellite data, and had built a rainwater collection system to reduce irrigation needs during dry periods. He'd done all of this using equipment held together with something he called baling wire and hope. Check. We have to pass him, Telia said finally. By every measurable standard, this operation qualifies. But how? Denick demanded. How is any of this possible? I don't know, Telia admitted, but the data doesn't lie. Yennet was quiet for a moment, then said, I think I understand. These humans, they didn't start with a perfect world and make it productive. They started with a nightmare and forced it to be productive. They didn't adapt their farming to their world. They adapted their world to their farming, and themselves to both, for generations. Can you imagine? Every single human farmer is descended from thousands of years of other humans who survived this planet long enough to reproduce. They're not just farmers. They're the end product of the most aggressive agricultural natural selection in the known universe. That's horrifying, Denick said. That's winning, Telia corrected. That's what winning looks like when the difficulty setting is certain death. They filed their report with a recommendation to approve Coleman's entry, along with several hundred pages of supporting documentation, 3 requests for additional hazard pay, and 1 suggestion that the classification system for habitable worlds be revised to include a new category. Class 12, humans are doing agriculture here, and we don't know how. Back on the commission station, Vexin read the report with growing disbelief. Then she read it again. Then she called the inspection team to confirm that they hadn't been exposed to any hallucinogenic substances during their visit. It's all real, Telia confirmed. Every word. We have video documentation. You have video of a human consuming unprocessed plant matter that was grown in open atmosphere? Multiple videos. They do it several times a day. They call them meals. Vexin approved Coleman's entry into the competition, then immediately filed a request for a sabbatical. She was denied. Someone had to see this through to the end. News of Earth's official entry spread quickly through agricultural circles. The response ranged from curiosity to outright mockery. Plix Torn, the 3-time champion, gave an interview to Galactic Agriculture Today where he said, I'm sure Mr. Hux is a competent farmer given his circumstances, but let's be realistic. He's growing food in what is essentially a war zone. That's survival, not agriculture. When asked for comment, Coleman said, I don't know what a Plix Torn is, but if he thinks farming's not survival, he's never had to bring in hay before a storm. The competition itself was held on Zentara Station, a massive orbital facility that had hosted the event for the past 50 cycles. Farmers from 200 worlds brought samples of their produce, detailed documentation of their operations, and in many cases, sophisticated holographic presentations. Coleman arrived with 3 crates of produce, a tablet full of photos, and a cooler full of Sarah's sandwiches. The exhibition hall was enormous, with each competitor allocated a booth to display their achievements. Coleman's booth was between Plix Torn's elaborate fungi presentation and a Yithrian showcasing her genetically optimized nutrient pods. Coleman unpacked his crates: corn on the cob, wheat sheaves, soybeans, several varieties of tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, squash, apples from his small orchard, and a massive pumpkin that had taken 3 people to load onto the transport. Farmers from other worlds drifted by to look, drawn by curiosity about the infamous Deathworld entry. "These are quite uniform," the Ythrian admitted, examining Coleman's corn. "Unexpected from a non-controlled environment." "Thank you," Coleman said. "Good genetics and decent weather this year. But how do you manage pollination without isolation chambers? Wind mostly, and bees. Atmospheric creatures control your pollination. They're pretty reliable." Plix Toron arrived with his entourage, all of them wearing expressions of barely concealed amusement. "So this is the famous Deathworld farmer," he chittered. "Tell me, Mr. Hux, how many of your crops die before reaching harvest? 50%? 60%? "Usually less than 5%, Coleman replied, "unless we get hail, but that's what crop insurance is for." 5%? Impossible! Our loss rate is below 1%, and that's with complete environmental control. "Well, I don't know what to tell you. That's just how it is." Plix picked up one of Coleman's tomatoes, examining it with his sensory tendrils. Despite himself, he was impressed by the uniformity, the color, the firmness. "What's your growing medium?" "Dirt." "No, I mean the substrate. The controlled nutrient matrix." "Yeah, dirt, soil, it's just ground. You're growing directly in planetary surface material. That's where plants grow." Plix put the tomato down carefully. "This is absurd. You can't possibly control nutrient ratios, pH balance, moisture content, or any of the relevant factors in random dirt." "It's not random. I test it every year and add amendments as needed. Lime if the pH is off, compost for nutrients, gypsum if the calcium's low. Pretty standard stuff." "Compost? What's compost?" "Rotted plant matter and manure. Makes great fertilizer." "You're adding decomposed biological waste to your growing medium." "Nature's recycling system." Plix made a sound that suggested his species' equivalent of nausea. "I'm going to enjoy watching you lose, Mr. Hux. You might have survived your barbaric world's attempt to kill you, but real agriculture requires precision, science, and civilized conditions." "If you say so," Coleman replied mildly. The judging took place over 3 days. Competitors were evaluated on yield data, resource efficiency, crop quality, innovation, and sustainability. Teams of experts examined every entry with instruments, tested samples, and reviewed documentation. When they came to Coleman's booth, they approached like anthropologists studying a newly discovered civilization. "These are organically grown?" one judge asked, scanning a tomato. "No pesticides except some neem oil when the aphids got bad," Coleman confirmed. "No growth accelerators, just sunshine and water." "Your yield data indicates 160 bushels of corn per acre. How?" "Hybrid seed, good soil management, adequate rainfall this year." Udi, they tested his produce with increasingly sophisticated equipment, looking for signs of genetic modification, chemical residues, or artificial enhancement. They found nothing but tomatoes that tasted like tomatoes, corn that was genuinely corn, and potatoes that had grown in actual dirt, like some kind of medieval farming technique. "This is impossible," one judge muttered. "The nutrient density is higher than most controlled environment crops." "Soil's good on my farm," Coleman said. "Built it up over generations. But without precise environmental control, you should have massive variation in quality." "Oh, there's variation. That's why I brought my best samples." The judging panel retreated to deliberate, and the farming community waited with bated breath, or whatever equivalent their respective species used to express anticipation. 3 days later, the results were announced. Third place went to a Vraxian crystal grain operation that achieved perfect geometric growth patterns through gravitational manipulation. Second place went to Plix Torn's fungi, which had showed impressive protein development and required minimal resource input. First place went to Coleman Hux of Earth. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then an uproar of protest, then demands for recounts, then accusations of fraud, then eventually grudging acceptance as judge after judge explained their reasoning. The yield data is irrefutable, the head judge announced. Mr. Hux produces more food per unit of land than any other entry, using fewer synthetic inputs, with greater crop diversity and remarkable nutrient density. His operation is not only productive, but sustainable across multiple generations. By every quantifiable metric in our evaluation criteria, his entry is superior. "But it's dirt!" someone shouted from the crowd. "He grows things in dirt." "Yes," the judge agreed, "and apparently that works." Coleman accepted the award with the same quiet dignity he approached everything else in life. They gave him a trophy made of crystallized minerals from 89 agricultural worlds. It was very heavy and probably cost more than his tractor. "I'm honored," he said into the microphone. "I'd like to thank my wife Sarah, who's the real genius in the garden, my daughter Jenny for putting up with harvest season every year, and my granddad for teaching me that good soil is worth more than gold, and I guess I should thank Earth itself for being just hard enough to keep things interesting." Plixtorn did not take the loss well. He approached Coleman after the ceremony with his entourage in tow, sensory tendrils quivering with indignation. "This is a fluke," he declared. "You got lucky with weather conditions. One good year on a Deathworld doesn't prove anything." "Maybe," Coleman agreed, "but it's not one good year. It's 6 generations of good years, give or take. I demand a recount, or better yet, a rematch. Let's see how your precious dirt farming holds up when real challenges—" "Plix," Coleman interrupted gently, "I'm going to stop you there. I didn't come here to prove anything except that my farm produces good food. And it does, the judges agreed. Now I've got to get home because it's planting season for winter wheat, and that won't wait for anybody's feelings. But I wish you the best with your fungi, I truly do. They looked real nice." He shook Plix's manipulator appendage, which was apparently not a gesture in Kelthrian culture, and caused a minor diplomatic incident, then headed back to his ship with his trophy. The journey back to Earth gave Coleman time to think about what had happened. He'd entered the competition on a whim, mostly because the entry fee was reasonable and Jenny had encouraged him. He hadn't expected to win. That seemed like the sort of thing that happened to other people with fancy equipment and perfect conditions. But the more he'd seen of other agricultural operations, the more he'd realized something. They were all trying to eliminate variables, control every aspect, remove chance from the equation, turn farming into a mathematical formula. Earth didn't allow that. Earth demanded you adapt, improvise, work with what you got. You couldn't control the weather, couldn't stop the pests, couldn't make it rain when you needed it. You could only respond, adjust, and keep trying. Maybe that was the advantage. Maybe being forced to deal with reality in all its messy, uncontrolled chaos made you better at the fundamental challenge of farming, producing food despite everything working against you. Or maybe he was overthinking it, and he'd just gotten lucky with good genetics and decent weather. Either way, he had a trophy. Back on Earth, news of Coleman's victory spread slowly through farming communities. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it also wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. Farmers are practical people. They were more interested in the rainfall forecast than intergalactic agricultural politics. But among the broader population, especially once the media got hold of it, the story took on mythical proportions. Human defeats galaxy's best farmers using dirt, Earth Deathworld status irrelevant to determined farmer. Local man wins space competition, mostly confused about trophy. Coleman gave exactly one interview to a local news station where he said, "It's nice to be recognized, but at the end of the day, it's still just farming. You put seeds in the ground, hope for rain, and see what happens." The interviewer asked if he had any advice for young people interested in agriculture. "Sure," Coleman said. "Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Farming's never going to be easy, no matter what planet you're on. Things will go wrong. Weather won't cooperate, equipment will break. That's just how it is. But if you can keep going anyway, if you can find satisfaction in growing things despite all that, then you'll do fine. Back at the Commission headquarters, Vexin was dealing with the aftermath of Earth's entry into the agricultural community. Requests poured in from farmers across the galaxy, wanting to know more about Deathworld farming techniques. Academic institutions wanted to study Earth agriculture. 3 different companies wanted to license the concept of compost for their artificial growing systems. Most bizarre was a request from Plixtorn himself, asking for permission to visit Earth and observe Coleman's operation firsthand. Vexin, who had developed a peculiar fondness for the human farmer despite everything he represented about the universe's refusal to make sense, approved the request. If Plix wanted to experience true horror, who was she to stop him? Plix arrived on Earth 6 months after the competition, accompanied by a small team of agricultural experts. They took the same shuttle route the inspection team had used, and as they descended through Earth's atmosphere, Plix began to understand what he'd gotten himself into. "That's a lot of water vapor," one of his team noted nervously as they passed through clouds. "Class 12 worlds typically have aggressive hydrological cycles," another replied, checking her instruments. "Precipitation averages over 1 meter annually." 1 meter? They landed in Coleman's field on a crisp October morning, and Plix emerged from the shuttle to find himself in what he could only describe as a temperature fluctuation event. The air was cold, not cold enough to freeze water, but cold enough to be deeply uncomfortable. "Is this normal?" he chittered at Coleman, who had walked over to greet them wearing a jacket. "Normal for October, yeah. Temperature dropped last night. We'll probably get our first frost soon." "Our first frost? How many frosts are there?" "Depends on the winter. Could be dozens, sometimes over 100 if it's a cold year." Plix's team retreated to the shuttle. Plix himself, driven by stubborn pride and genuine curiosity, stayed outside. "Show me your operation," he said. "I want to understand how you do this." Coleman spent the next week showing Plix every aspect of his farm. They walked the fields, examined the soil, discussed crop rotation and pest management. Plix slowly, reluctantly, began to understand the complex web of decisions and adaptations that made Earth agriculture work. "You're not fighting against one variable," he realized. "You're managing thousands of variables simultaneously. Weather, pests, soil chemistry, crop genetics, timing, equipment maintenance, market conditions. That's farming," Coleman agreed. "But how do you manage all that without computational assistance?" "Experience, mostly. You farm long enough, you develop a feel for things. When to plant, when to harvest, when to irrigate. My granddad called it farmer's intuition. Scientists would probably call it pattern recognition developed through years of observation." "But you fail sometimes, yes? Crops die, harvests are lost." "Sure. That's part of it. You can't win every year. Some years the weather doesn't cooperate, or the market's bad, or equipment breaks at the wrong time. You do what you can, accept what you can't control, and try again next year." This acceptance of failure as an inherent part of the process was completely alien to Plix's worldview. In Kelthrian agriculture, failure was a sign of inadequate planning, insufficient control, or technological deficiency. It was something to be eliminated through better systems. "But don't you want perfect control?" Plix asked. "Don't you want to remove the uncertainty?" Coleman thought about this for a while. "I mean, sure, some certainty would be nice. But I think if you had perfect control, you'd lose something important. The satisfaction of a good harvest comes partly from knowing it could have failed. You worked hard, made good decisions, and things turned out. That means something because it was uncertain. That's insane. Maybe, but it works for us." On Plix's last day on Earth, Coleman took him to see the vegetable garden. It was late fall now, and Sarah was putting the garden to bed for winter, covering beds with mulch, pulling up spent plants, preparing for the cold months ahead. "All this will die?" Plix asked, watching her work. The annuals will, Sarah confirmed. But that's fine. They've done their job. In spring we'll plant again. But all that work. Work's not wasted if it produces food, Sarah said simply. We ate well this year. Canned and froze plenty for winter. Shared with neighbors and family. Now we rest the soil, let it recover, and start fresh in spring. That's the cycle. Plix watched her cover a bed with mulch made from last year's leaves, and something in his agricultural philosophy shifted. These humans weren't farming. Despite their world's hostility, they were farming in partnership with it, working with cycles and seasons and natural processes rather than against them. It was messy and uncertain and completely dependent on factors beyond their control. It should have been impossible, but somehow it worked, and not just worked, thrived. When Plix returned to Kelthria Prime, he shocked his colleagues by announcing he was going to experiment with variable condition agriculture. He wanted to introduce controlled uncertainties into his growing systems to see if it improved the quality of his fungi. You want to make things more difficult? His assistant asked. I want to make things more real, Plix corrected. The human won because his crops are adapted to stress. They're stronger because they have to be. I want to see if my fungi can be stronger too. The experiments were a disaster at first. Fungi died, systems failed. Plix lost 3 entire crops before he started to figure out the balance between control and chaos. But slowly, gradually, his fungi began showing improvements. They were hardier, more resilient, and contained higher nutrient levels. His yields dropped compared to his perfectly controlled previous systems, but the quality improved dramatically. When he entered the competition the following year with his stress-adapted fungi, he took second place behind a Vraxian protein pod operation. Coleman took first place again, this time with a winter wheat variety he'd been developing. They met at the award ceremony, and Plix approached with something that might have been respect in his posture. You've created a monster, Plix said. Half the agricultural community is now experimenting with Deathworld techniques. Do you know there's actually a market now for naturally stressed crops? They sell for twice the price of perfect specimens. People are weird, Coleman observed. Yes, but they're also right. Your crops are better. I've spent the last cycle trying to figure out why, and I think I understand. You're not just growing food, you're growing survivors. Every plant that makes it to harvest on Earth has proven it can handle stress. That quality is literally encoded in the genetics you select for next year's seed. You're running an evolutionary pressure system that's been going for generations. I suppose that's one way to look at it. It's horrifying and brilliant, and I hate that it works. Coleman smiled. You're welcome to visit the farm any time. Sarah says you're welcome to stay for dinner if you come back. She wants to know if you can eat tomatoes. I actually don't know. I've never had access to naturally stressed produce before. It wasn't considered safe. Well, if you want to find out, the invitation's open. The awards ceremony ended, and farmers from 200 worlds mingled in the exhibition hall. Conversations flowed about techniques, challenges, innovations. And increasingly, those conversations included references to Earth methods, Deathworld adaptations, and the persistent question, if humans can make it work in those conditions, what are we capable of? The Ythrian who had admired Coleman's corn approached him with a proposal. Would you be willing to share seed stock? I want to try growing Earth corn on my world. Obviously, conditions are much safer there, but I'm curious if your genetics would outperform my current varieties. Sure, Coleman said. I'll send you some when I get home. No charge. Just let me know how it does. This simple generosity became typical of Coleman's approach to his unexpected fame in the agricultural community. He shared techniques freely, answered questions patiently, and never seemed to grasp that he'd become something of a legend. The Deathworld farmer became a shorthand in agricultural circles for the idea that conventional wisdom wasn't always right, that challenges could be advantages, and that sometimes the best way to grow food was to embrace reality rather than fight it. Back on Earth, Coleman's farm continued operating exactly as it always had. The trophy sat on a shelf in the living room, between Jenny's college graduation photo and a picture of Coleman's granddad standing in the same fields 70 years earlier. Seed catalogues arrived each winter. Equipment broke and was repaired, weather did what weather does, and crops were planted with the eternal optimism of farmers everywhere. This year will be good. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But the farm endured, as it had for 6 generations, and as Coleman hoped it would for 6 more. He'd learned something from his journey into galactic agriculture. Earth wasn't remarkable because it was dangerous. It was remarkable because humans had chosen to make it home anyway, had learned to work with its chaos rather than against it, and had created something sustainable and productive in the process. That was the real victory, he thought. Not the trophy or the recognition or even beating Plix's fungi. The real victory was the simple fact that every year he put seeds in the ground, and every year, despite everything, they grew. Years passed. The story of Earth's entry into galactic agriculture became part of the standard curriculum in agricultural schools across 89 galaxies. The Coleman-Hux principle was coined to describe the advantage gained by adapting to challenging conditions rather than eliminating them. Earth itself was reclassified from Class 12 Hazard World, Agricultural Operations Impossible, to Class 12 Hazard World, Humans are doing agriculture. Here somehow. It wasn't much of an improvement, but it was accurate. Coleman continued farming, continued winning the occasional competition when he bothered to enter, and continued being bewildered by the attention. He was a farmer. That's all he'd ever wanted to be. The fact that he was doing it on what the galaxy considered a nightmare hellscape was to him just circumstantial. Sarah continued to tend her garden, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for agricultural enthusiasts. They'd arrive in shuttles, wearing hazard suits, and stare in wonder at tomatoes growing in actual dirt while being occasionally rained on. Sarah would offer them fresh vegetables, which most politely declined out of terror, and send them away with recipes just in case they got brave later. Jenny, Coleman's daughter, eventually took over more of the farm operations as Coleman got older. She'd grown up in the aftermath of her father's unexpected fame and had developed a unique perspective on the whole thing. "Dad grows corn," she'd tell curious visitors, "really good corn." The fact that the galaxy thinks this is some kind of miraculous achievement says more about the galaxy than it does about us. She had her grandfather's pragmatism and her mother's warmth, and she ran the farm with quiet competence that suggested the operation would continue for at least another generation. One evening, many years after his first competition win, Coleman sat on his porch watching the sun set over his fields. The corn was coming in strong this year. The wheat had been excellent. The tomatoes were almost offensively perfect, according to Sarah. A shuttle landed in the field, and a young Kelthrian emerged, walking carefully toward the house. "Mr. Hux," the young farmer called. "My name is Ven Torn. I'm Plix Torn's spawn child. He sent me to learn from you before he passed. He said understanding your methods was the most important thing he learned in his career." Coleman stood, joints creaking in the way that told him rain was coming tomorrow. "I'm sorry to hear about Plix. He was a good farmer and a good person. Come on up to the house. Sarah just made lemonade." Ven climbed the porch steps, looking around at the farm with the same mixture of terror and fascination that all alien visitors seemed to experience. "This is really where you grow food?" Ven asked. "In the open? With no protection?" "This is where my family's grown food for 190 years now," Coleman confirmed. "Still works. My parents said you told him that farming was about acceptance, accepting what you couldn't control, and working with what you could." "That sounds like something I might have said. Could you teach me? I want to understand how you do this, how you think about this." Coleman looked out at his fields. at the corn swaying in the evening breeze, at the storm clouds building on the horizon, at the land that had sustained his family for generations despite being classified as one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy. "I can try," he said, "but I'm not sure there's much to teach. You plant seeds, you water them when you can, you wait for rain when you can't, and you hope things work out. That's farming. My parents said it was more than that. And well, maybe it is. Maybe it's about recognizing that perfect conditions don't exist anywhere. Not really. Even the controlled environments have equipment failures and power outages and system glitches. The difference is just what you do when things go wrong. Do you give up or do you adapt and keep going? And that's the Deathworld secret? Just keep going?" Coleman smiled. "That's the Earth secret. And it's not much of a secret at all. Every farmer in history on every world has to learn the same thing. The land doesn't care about your plans. The weather doesn't care about your schedule. Pests don't care about your profit margins. You do the work anyway, because somebody's got to grow the food, and you figure out how to do it where you are with what you got." They sat in silence for a while, watching the storm roll in, watching the lightning dance between the clouds, watching the rain begin to fall on fields that would drink it in and transform it into food. "It's beautiful," Ven said quietly. "Terrifying, but beautiful." "Yeah," Coleman agreed. "That's Earth for you." The rain fell harder, and they moved inside where Sarah had dinner ready. They ate tomatoes fresh from the garden, corn from the field, bread made from their own wheat. Simple food grown in dirt, watered by rain, harvested by hand. The most dangerous agricultural operation in the known universe. And somehow, against all probability and reason and expert opinion, it worked. It had always worked. It would keep working, because that's what farmers do, whether they're on paradise worlds with perfect conditions or Class 12 nightmare planets that actively try to kill everything. They put seeds in the ground and convince them to grow. Everything else is just details. Outside, the storm continued its ancient routine of watering the earth. Lightning struck a rod Coleman's grandfather had installed 60 years ago. Thunder rolled across the fields, and deep in the soil, seeds that would become next year's crop waited patiently for their chance to prove that life, given even the slightest opportunity, finds a way. Even on Deathworlds. Especially on Deathworlds. Because when the universe makes things difficult, humans take it personally and grow tomatoes out of spite.